Hello, I'm Dr. Angie McCartney.
And I'm Ruth McCartney.
Welcome to TeaFlix,
where each episode's intimate conversation features a fascinating guest across the spectrum of Beatles world, pop culture, Grammy winners, the music industry, chefs, producers, music stars, actors, and more. So bottoms up and join us as they spill the tea on TeaFlix. We are live once again, folks.
Jolly good.
We
are live, I hope.
Happy Tuesday and happy birthday, George Harrison in heaven. We are wearing our Here Comes the Sun colors today, especially for our George, wherever he is. Namaste, baby. We're really excited to get today's guest on. He is also a podcast host, so we're a bit nervous today because we're having to ply our trade in front of professionals, and it's like, oops-a daisy. Just checking upstairs that Martin can see us. We are good. Excellent. And Robert Rodriguez is our guest today, who is a fabulous, not only an author and a podcaster, but I would say a researcher and a bit of a savant when it comes to not just Beatles, but all things music and recording and so on and so forth. So Robert has written extensively about the Beatles, 5 books so far. So it puts me to shame. I haven't started on one, including Solo in the 70s and 2012's acclaimed Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. He's the host of the Something About the Beatles podcast. He's contributed numerous articles to Beatle Fan magazine and has been a regular interviewee on radio and TV about the group. Robert is also the creator of the Frequently Asked Questions book series for Hal Leonard, the world's largest print music publisher, and he maintains a daily archival page on Facebook where you can learn about the rock world the Beatles inhabited. And today, we're here more specifically to dive into Volume 1 of Ribbons of Rust, which he has just co-authored with one of our lovely previous guests, Jerry Hammack. So confetti and applause all around for Robert Rodriguez. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, Robert. Good morning.
Great to see you guys. A lovely George matching shirts for his 82nd birthday, I guess.
It is. Yeah, there's a funny, we were in Bahamas. They were filming Help. And my birthday is the 15th and George is 10 days later. So on the 20th, we had a joint birthday party and they had a German pastry chef who made a beautiful German chocolate cake with a big, nasty brown chocolate beetle on it.
Insect beetle.
A kafer beetle, an insect beetle. And he wrote, "Happy birthday, J-A-J-A-J-A, ya, in German, ya.
Perfect.
I wish we had a picture of the cake, but unfortunately we don't. So I'm butting in. It's Madam's show. So
yes, okay. So for starters, where did it all begin? How did you first become interested in the Beatles?
That's an interesting question because I wasn't of age to be a fan in real time, and that has its pluses and minuses. Sometimes when I talk to so many first-gen fans, and a lot of them went on to change the world after seeing them on the Sullivan Show, ended up in great bands or ended up having careers in the arts because of what they witnessed that night. That's how huge their impact was. So I only vicariously can get that real-time excitement. But my gateway drug was in the 70s, the Red and the Blue albums. And those compilations when they came out. It's funny, I talked to plenty of people my age that was their gateway drug too. I will say that in my community, among my peers, at that time, there was nothing less cool than being a Beatles fan because everybody was into Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and things like that. And that's your parents' music, that's your older siblings' music. But so I had to kind of like protect and keep it sort of on the down low that I was a freak for this stuff until my time came.
A closet Beatle fan.
That was, exactly. A DL. The kids say on the DL now, wouldn't they?
Down low.
So you didn't have enough Riz if you were a Beatle fan, I suppose.
That word, yes.
I
must figure out what it means someday.
Charisma, Riz.
Oh.
Charisma.
Okay.
It's the middle bit of that. So you've written also several other books that I mentioned at the top of the show prior to collaborating with Jerry. Tell us a little bit about, when you get the germ of an idea for a book like Solo in the 70s, or let's say Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. Mm-hmm. Does it come to you? Does the title come to you, or are you listening to a piece of music and you go, God, that'd be a great niche for, how did the Revolver book come about creatively?
It's sort of like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I get ideas constantly. Somebody will say something, or I'll come across something random in a piece of reading, and I'm thinking, I want to know more. On the Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ, so it's like we have to dig and dig and dig. It's like till we're satisfied we've got all there is to know about something. And most people, the world considers that geekiness or dorkiness or whatever, but it's an itch that needs to be scratched. So it had occurred to me that Revolver was an album that didn't quite get the same spotlight as Pepper. And I've done a lot of thinking and researching and talking to people about this, and there are reasons. But to me, it was like in plain sight, this is a fantastic, unbelievable achievement for these four guys, head and shoulders above everything that came beyond. They were always evolving, of course, but this was like, what an accomplishment. So I started to research. It's like, well, why didn't it get its due in 1966? And it was like, well, more popular than Jesus tended to tamp down the enthusiasm when that's the headline.
Great PR.
Yeah, right. So there were reasons. But I think in the CD era, when we got the full-blown British iteration on CD, so people could hear what that Beatles had actually put out in 66, that tended to sort of get to this point of reassessment. It's like, oh, this really was an amazing album, and too bad we got a truncated version in the States. But certainly the Brit pop bands of the mid 90s were getting into it, sort of taking their visual cues off the Beatles of 66. So I'm glad that it came around, and the world, it's all good. But I thought there was a story worth telling about how the Beatles came to craft that album.
Well, and Oasis springs to mind, right? There wouldn't be an Oasis if they hadn't gone back and rediscovered that whole era, of course. And now, they're in their reunion phase, and people are flying across the world to see them.
Yes.
But it must be nice to have, as a writer, the luxury of being a good bit younger than your subjects and having their major body of work released. I know Paul and Ringo are still out there hoofing it and doing great stuff. But because you can then go back in time and cherry pick, like Rubber Soul would be my favorite album. Just is. Don't know why, but maybe it's,
you're not alone,
what was going on around me as a child at the time or what have you. But it's nice to be able to have all of that material out there. And the question I'm leading to is, like we've been doing for a decade, you are using QR codes to link people to multimedia immersive materials. There's so much of it out there. How on earth do you pick which Pathé Marconi newsreel to link to, or that's another whole writing exercise, isn't it?
Yes, that's a really good point, because there is too much choice potentially, but that's where you being a curator comes in. You can do all kinds of research. You can. I mean, my main thing, if there's anything I'm good at or that I tend to focus at as a writer and researcher, it's context. Placing people into the world that, as we get increasingly distant from it, it's a lot harder to understand when, if you're a music fan, you've heard everything now. You've seen everything now. In 1966, this stuff was new. In 1956, Elvis and Lonnie Donegan was new. So it's impossible for people born decades later to feel the same impact, as I kind of alluded to anyway, as like a second generation Beatle fan. So what you have to do is, well, what would the people of that era have witnessed? What would they have seen? And you've got this beautiful archive on YouTube of British Pathé newsreels. So, here's one on rationing, the end of rationing in 1954. What a great starting point for the book, because this is where the convergence comes in of suddenly kids born in wartime, 1939, 1940 in Britain, they're becoming teenagers, they're becoming autonomous, they're, getting to the point, as we all do as teenagers, we're sort of rejecting your parents' culture. We want our culture. We're going to identify, this is our identity, not what you guys shoved down our throats. So that's happening. Rationing's ending. They've got a bit more access to things that they couldn't get before. And then lo and behold, this British guy is singing American blues things with conviction. Lonnie Donegan is singing Lead Belly.
Yeah.
Who knew such a thing was possible? And the other side of the pond, Bill Haley cracks it with Rock Around the Clock, which is sort of this forbidden fruit thing from the Blackboard Jungle, this Certificate X film in Britain. And then Elvis right on the heels of that, something no one's ever seen anything like that before. So for people even my own age, but younger, is how the hell do you convey to them how exciting hearing that snap of the snare drum on Rock Around the Clock? What an exciting, heart-stopping, transformational thing that was. So you try your best. You bring in the sounds of the songs, you bring in the visuals, the record sleeves, and you bring in the Pathé newsreels to put them in that world. It's like, oh, now I get it. Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, linking, like I said, we've been doing it with Angie's books for years. And, you know, we've sat, haven't we, and gone through hours and hours and hours of video to try and exactly paint the picture. And, you know, if we only had smell-o-vision, right, and we could put you in the fish and chip shop. And you remember rationing, don't you?
Oh, yeah, I've still got a ration book. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes, that is such a cool artifact at the time. And, you know, we obviously weren't being bombed and invaded during World War II, but certainly people, my parents' generation, generations before, you live through that. You never forget the Depression. You never forget the war.
Yeah.
The war. It was always the war. You knew which war when they said the war.
Yeah.
The big one.
War.
Yeah.
My war. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, people say to me now, with all the problems that are going on in the world, I say, hey, Hitler couldn't get me, so nothing else is going to get me.
Right.
I'm still here. I got through that. I can get through this.
Exactly. Sure. Whatever it is, she's like, I see you, whatever. I raise you, Adolf Hitler. She's still here.
Yeah. Follow that. Yeah.
That's absolutely.
We didn't think we were having a hard time, though. We just got on with it.
Exactly. Yeah. You got on. It was you had no frame of reference. This is your normal.
Yeah.
Right.
So how did you and Jerry research and document all the nuanced pieces and, you know, the creative evolution during those informative years, when you first started working together?
I'm blessed to know Jerry Hammack because in addition to being a superb writer and a technical head, I'm not technical. So yeah, you want to talk about limiters and compressors and noise gates and all that stuff. You know, my eyes will glaze over like a lot of people's will. But he's got the gift of being able to explain it. Oh, that's what I'm hearing. And he's been researching this to death for decades now as a producer himself, as a musician himself. So he is able to understand as a practitioner what the Beatles were doing as he's, you know, reverse engineering it, as it were. But as he likes to say, it's like, I can tell you everything that went on inside the studio. You're the guy that knows everything that went on outside the studio. And being, you know, a history geek as I've been my entire life, even before I discovered the Beatles, when I was in single digits, I used to read the encyclopedia for fun because we had one in the house, and you know, furthering my alienation from my peers. But it's paid off in the long run, I suppose.
Yeah. But, well, so when you got together and decided that the divide and conquer was quite obvious, wasn't it? He was the tech head, and you were the history, pop culture icon buff. Yeah.
And so we there's plenty of things out there that explain the records per se. And in his own previous series, as you know, you had him on the show, the Recording Reference Manual series. Anything you want to know from the Beatles stepping foot into that studio, he's got you covered. But what he lacked and what he recognized as a lack is, well, what was the context around them? What were they listening to? What was inspiring them? What was informing their decisions as artists? And that's where I came in. So to do a book like this, and I've done this now for a few of my books. I did it for Solo in the 70s. I did it with Revolver, is I create a timeline. I start with a timeline because that's sort of a good roadmap if you know what was going on in the world, what were the releases coming out, what would they have been listening to. It's like you connect the dots from that. It's like, oh, they heard this and this happened the following week, or so that's how you start to make sense of it.
Right. And, you know, today being George's 82nd birthday, he obviously had an enormous influence when he got interested in the Ayurvedic arts and the mystical and all things Indian. Of course, being a musician, the first thing he's going to go to outside of yoga and diet and meditation is, well, what are the instruments? What do they play? You know, there's a song that I don't believe it's ever been released on vinyl. Correct me if I'm wrong. Called Dehradun. Have you heard it?
It came out in the digital era. I don't know if there's a vinyl release, but written in India.
Dehradun. And coincident, the way the world ties little bows around things, one of our clients, one of our chefs that we represent, he's a Michelin star chef out of Houston called Chef Mayank Istwal from Musafir, which means traveler. He was born in Dehradun.
Oh, wow.
And now he's a client, and here we are. And so, yeah, it's just the universe has mysterious way across the universe that you will find little red threads of people that, all get tied together. And,
all the time.
You think about George, if George hadn't gone down that path and Ravi Shankar and them going to Rishikesh, who knows if any of those songs would have been written? Certainly not Dear Prudence.
And then look at the influence that he wrought on Western culture by being in the biggest band on earth. I had Patty Boyd on the show. She was the one that initially brought up the Eastern stuff. She saw an ad for a lecture by the Maharishi in London, the practitioner of TM, Transcendental Meditation. She turns on George. George turns on the Beatles. The Beatles turn on youth culture. Words like, karma and yoga and all these things we take for granted as part of the vocabulary today, all drawn from Eastern culture. The Beatles was the pipeline for that.
Well, and also, if you think about it, food, George was an early investor in one of London's first Indian restaurants.
That's right.
And so, the food culture changed. We got deep into this with Chef Mayank about, when he was way before he was born, but their village and their region, which is at the foot of the Himalayas, has the Beatles to thank for turning the world on to Indian food is the way they look at it, which is a whole nother avenue outside of music in the pop culture world that you just don't even really tie back to George. But in my mind, he can take credit for it.
Sure. And that's the thing about the Beatles generally, is that when you drill down, if you're enough of a student of them that you want to understand what influenced them and where that particular thing on a song came from. Sword mandal. What is that? Oh, it's an Indian instrument, tambura. You can go down that way. Or, I'm listening to Star Club tapes. They're doing a Fats Waller song. Who's Fats Waller? You can go down that direction.
Right.
The education you can get to a thoughtful, analytical listener and student of the Beatles will take you everywhere in the world.
Yes.
They're the gift that keeps on giving in that way, and on so many other levels too. But that was the thing that if you're a curious person and you want to understand things, you suss out the Beatles story and then you start drilling down deeper. So with this book, I was trying to, where did these early songs of the Beatles, where did this stuff come from? What was influencing them? And then you come to the reckoning that, wait a minute, rock and roll didn't hit them till they were 15, 16 years old.
Right.
Their musicality prior to that, what were they listening to? The Music Hall, show tunes, Great American Songbook, whatever was on BBC Light programming. So they're absorbing all this stuff. So of course, right out of the gate, when they start crafting their own material, it's bigger than rock and roll. It's bigger than 1-4-5 blues progressions. It's way bigger than that because they're creative, smart people that are repurposing absolutely everything around them.
Yeah. Well, and Liverpool was also a big port, wasn't it? The musical influence. I mean, what were you listening to growing up? Angie's a good bit older. She's 95.
I like classical music. And I was a piano student, and I was a real boring 4 hours a day. I would practice without having to be asked or anything. I loved it. And people used to say, oh, God, she's playing that bloody Warsaw Concerto again. This is when I was like 12, 13.
But
14.
on the radios, there'd be Glenn Miller, big band, the big band stuff.
Yeah,
the American
and stuff from the variety theatres, like Happy Days Are Here Again, the Billy Cotton Band show.
And also Carolina Moon and the Barbershop Quartet, the McCartney family, every New Year's Eve, wherever they are, they still get around the piano, and all the women go out and clean up the kitchen and get the next round of drinks in, and the men all sing Carolina Moon.
An incredible richness that you take for granted, because at some point, certainly during the 60s, during the Beatles hit-making era, you can look at any chart for any top 40 radio station, and there might be Painted Black by the Stones alongside Something Stupid by Frank Sinatra, alongside Hello Dolly by Louis Armstrong. It was incredibly diverse, incredibly, just broad spectrum of music that you can get an education from. And eventually it became more balkanized as, radios became tightly formatted, and this is NOR, this is MOR, whatever. So again, you can be, if you recognize the value of that, you can be a bit jealous of the previous generations who got a much wider education.
Yeah. When you just said timeline, I mean, how lucky, I've said it before and I'll say it again, Chuck. How lucky are we to be alive in the timeline of the billions of years of the universe. And we're in this little tiny blip where we have the Beatles, we have Mozart, we have, to Elizabeth's point, Mozart, we have Salvador Dali, we have Picasso, we have Jules Verne. To me, growing up sort of in the bubble, the Beatles were the Jules Vernes of my world, because I would get postcards from all over the place. I'd be like, where's Miami? So I'd go and get the book. I'd go and get an atlas and look it up. They were the Jules Vernes that went out for us, the general public, the fans, and discovered these new things, instruments, what was on the radio, what was playing in the limo on the way to the gig. And they weren't these sort of uppity stars who would not talk to anybody. They'd quiz taxi drivers and housekeepers and things like that. Well, what are you listening to? John was mostly very inquisitive, and he'd always want to know, what was going on outside their bubble. And I think they had this incredible ability to stand on the stage and do their job, but also still connect with their fans and their people and be able to be inquisitive, like you say, and then go find those things and bring them to the fore.
It is not an accident that we still revere their music, and it stands today every bit as fresh as it was the day it was made. And their individual capacity for receptivity and open-mindedness, that's not an accident. The reason it is so fresh and diverse is because, again, they're the hammers, everything's a nail, they're bringing everything to them. What can we do with this record that we like, that we can build on it, make it a little bit better? And everything was fair game. Any kind of idea, the best idea in the room won every time.
Right, because they didn't really have an ego about it, especially if you watch all of the Peter Jackson stuff now. Obviously, John and Paul were the type A who were going to get it done no matter what. But again, I think just the magic of the four of them, Pete Best is a lovely man and an incredible drummer, but Ringo just had those out-of-the-box ideas that, I think of Ringo as an arranger. A lot of their songs wouldn't be the same if you just had a four-on-the-floor drum beat.
Exactly. Yeah, he was beyond the atom beat. And that, I think, was a big, big key to the quality of the records they made, was his versatility, his apprenticeship at Butlins and playing for every kind of crowd, that he could do the Latin thing. He could do the cha-cha. He could do
and he's
whatever was
left-handed,
Yeah.
which is amazing.
He's left-handed, and he'd have to show up to a gig and play a right-handed kit.
But it gave him an extra sort of magic in his fills that every studio drummer in America in the 60s play like Ringo. I don't know what the hell he's doing, but it's amazing. Play like him.
Yeah, he swings, and obviously, the bass section, Paul's left-handed, Ringo's left-handed, the rhythm section. There's just a different swing. They're using a different side of the brain. And so, that's another tiny little ingredient that you couldn't have auditioned for or put together like these boy bands. It's all about how tall are you, what do you look like, and how white are your teeth. And by the way, can you sing?
Right.
Yeah, how white are your teeth?
You can't engineer chemistry.
No, it's again back to food, which is I'm a super foodie. Is that you can have the crap out of the box or the meal on the airplane, or you can have an organic vegetable soup that's made with love, and boy, every time the organic will win.
Exactly.
It's the same in the music.
Yes, I also think too a big feature of the boys was their sense of humor.
Oh God, yeah.
Their ability to laugh at themselves and laugh at life, because they were virtually prisoners once it really got going. But
they had that built-in egalitarianism where they recognized, well, maybe there's a bit of a pecking order here. You referred to two type A types, but nobody's opinion carried more weight than anybody else's. If Ringo wanted to veto something, it was vetoed. End of story.
That's right.
Still the same to this day with Apple, with the company. Mm-hmm. There's no quorum. There's no 3 versus 1.
Right.
Everybody has to vote and agree. It's 4-0, or it doesn't happen.
You know your place, and they certainly did musically. And then you had Brian as the father figure that when he was there, everything was, he was a gatekeeper. He protected them from the world, kept them in a bubble, kept them away from the business stuff. But it was a huge, huge loss when they didn't have him around anymore. And you saw how it destabilized them.
When you think how young Brian was when he died, my goodness,
It's staggering to this world to just think about the 7 years they were recording, 62 to 69, what they accomplished. That's like 7 years between albums now for a contemporary artist. Just the amount of ground they covered, the revolution they set in motion. You cannot imagine time moving that fast now and evolving at a super high quality level.
Yeah. And I think we have too much information available at the moment, don't you? I mean, we're bombarded with information, all the different social media channels. I mean, Ruth and Martin, her husband, they do a lot of graphic design and all kinds of things, voiceovers, books on tape, and technology.
Social media, websites.
Every single morning they're waking up to something new in the way of technology.
When I was a kid growing up, I used to look forward to my favorite artist's record coming out. I'd get an extra job. I'd get pocket money. I'd save up. And on the Saturday, she would drive me to the record shop, and I would go home and the smell of the vinyl, and I'd read the lyrics, and sometimes there was a poster. And as a teenager, that's all I would do with my whole first weekend of a new, David Cassidy Cherish record or something. But nowadays, it's just like everybody's like this. And I honestly think the quality of music is suffering.
I think that the far outstripping of technology to human beings' ability to absorb it comfortably has really made a difference with why everybody is so stressed out now. It's way too much. And that whole tactile thing you described with a brand new record, I mean, it's almost like we lived in the last golden era of that stuff. A 12 by 12 template of a piece of art. Sometimes there'd be a booklet in it. Sometimes there'd be a poster in it. But you can remember what it felt like, what it smelled like, that buzz you'd get out stripping the shrink wrap off of it and watching that new label spin and just absorbing it. Now you skip a track if you're buying a CD, or worse yet, you're downloading individual tracks. It's not the same thing. It's not the same vision that the creator had for that. You've got a bit of latitude where you're making yourself part of the process, and maybe there's something to be said for that. But if an artist has a vision, and the Beatles certainly were masters of sequencing with them and George Martin, and of presentation, and starting down with this song and ending on this note here, they knew exactly what they were doing. You take away that control, put it in the hands of the listeners. To my ears, or my mindset, it's a bit of a diminished experience than the one that they originally intended for you.
Yeah, and also, in those times that you had people that became, Peter Max, for example, who became famous as, the artist, the album cover artwork people. There was a whole genre.
Hypnosis. Remember them in the 70s?
Hypnosis. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they went on to have art galleries, and these people would have art showings and so on and so forth. May Pang, our dear friend May, she's still out there with some of her photographs from, her John days. And so again, because they were absolute perfectionists and had this notion of the whole product should be as representative and as organic as it could be to represent them, they spawned a whole world of, album cover art and photographers and stylists, and who knew? I mean, that wasn't a thing in the 60s, but,
Isn't it astonishing when you think about it in the history of the Beatles that it was their tremendous fortune, and maybe somebody more steeped in this stuff can give an explanation through the laws of attraction. But from day one, before they were anybody, they go to Hamburg, West Germany, they run into a Klaus Vormann and an Astrid Kirchherr and a Jürgen Vollmer, world-class artists and photographers. They get drawn into the world. Their lives are rocked ever after. The Beatles are. And you look at something like John's rock and roll album cover, Jürgen Vollmer.
Yeah,
this is art stuff. It was not intended as an album cover. It's a snapshot, or the pictures, the fairground pictures Astrid took. So all along the line, Bob Whitaker and Robert Freeman, it was their great fortune. And then later on, an Ethan Russell, a Linda Eastman, all these tremendous people with great eyes that were simpatico on some kind of artistic vision level were drawn to them and gave us something out of that, documenting the Beatles at whatever point in their career. And yes, if you're talking about album covers and design and all that stuff, the Pepper album, the most expensive album cover to that point, a gatefold, lyrics on it. That's where you really have the Beatles putting the world on notice. This is art, folks. Pay attention. This isn't just a rock and roll collection of potential hit singles.
No, and weren't you saying the other day there's a theory afoot that the drum and the pepper and the placement may have been based on another photograph?
Yes, one near and dear to your family.
Yeah.
Jim Mack's band.
Jim Mack's band, yeah. And I was telling Robert that my dad's band from the 1920s, there's a little known movie in America. It's famous in England called Ethel and Ernest, and it's a cartoon. I wouldn't say it's a cartoon. It's a graphic novel movie, voiced by some very famous people, Brenda Blethyn and Oscar and BAFTA winning actors. And they wanted Walking in the Park with Eloise, my dad's song for it. And Paul agreed. MPL has the publishing and the administration rights, and said, wouldn't it be great if we bookended it? I've never had a song in a movie with my dad's song. And so, of course, they're going to go, well, yeah. And there's a little nugget, if anybody goes to watch the film, where Ethel and Ernest go on their first date to a dance hall. And as they walk into the doors on the right, there's a little poster and it says, "Tonight, Jim Mack's band."
What a cool little Easter egg.
It's in there for like 5 seconds.
I'll send you some info on that later in an email.
Please do, yeah. The right people will get it too. Don't underestimate them.
Yeah. We went to Palm Springs Film Festival to see its film.
Yes, it won quite a number of awards.
Premiere, and and I was telling Robert I was wearing my dad's overcoat, and I still have the ticket in the pocket. So
wow.
I like to think he saw it from somewhere.
Absolutely. He's present.
One reading your book, and Ribbons of Rust, fascinating.
It is,
and I have to sort of wean myself off it at night. I think, put the light out, go to sleep. It's almost beginning to get daylight, but it's a wonderful book, and it's just so much food for thought. Now, you work back, you covered sessions from the Quarrymen and live performances. And what challenges did you make in sort of reconstructing these moments, and what sort of methods did you use to research it all?
We talked to everybody that we could that knew something, and that included something that'll resonate with you guys, Forthland Road. Oh, yeah. We'd known there were 2 taping sessions done in 1960 at Forthland Road. That's the McCartney residence at that time. And these tapes have circulated. A bit of them were used on Anthology. And so Jerry, being the technological guy to pursue that, had to do a bit of research from the perspective. We've got a handed down version. I think Paul's own words. Yeah, we recorded it in the bathroom to get that natural echo. Well, we then tracked down like a blueprint of the house to see, well, how was that possible? What did that look like? And we found the dimensions and all this stuff. So it's like we were able to conclude, okay, the number of personnel on these recordings, you couldn't squeeze that many guys and their amps and instruments into the bathroom proper, but you could have put the mic in there to get that echo, and that would make sense. So it's that kind of thing that we went beyond the stories we've been told. Well, is that true? Is that possible? Let's see what it was like. Or the story with the Percy Phillips recordings in Liverpool. I'd come across a couple mentions. We know about the ones that were used in Anthology, that 1958 Quarrymen record, In Spite of All the Danger, That'll Be the Day. That's very well documented. But I'd come across a couple things. There was a guy named Arthur Kelly who was a good friend of George's, and in fact, I guess lived closer to the Percy Phillips facility than did the other Quarrymen. And he'd made mention very vividly, descriptively of, well, that wasn't the only one they did at Percy Phillips. They went back there and they recorded One After 909. The song that's like a through line in the Beatles' career from the Quarrymen to Let It Be Rooftop. And it doesn't exist. We haven't seen it, and nobody had really mentioned it before. So we got a dialogue going with the grandson of Percy Phillips, who's still there sort of curating the facility.
That's
they
great.
said, well, guess what? There was a second Quarrymen session. The logbook for 1960 is lost, but we do know it did. I can attest that was a thing. It did exist. So now the record's gone and the documentation of it is gone, but Arthur Kelly was right. I guess at some point Paul acknowledged that they did it, and now Percy Phillips' grandson saying, yes, it was a thing. So one more thing lost in the wild, a record of the Beatles.
That is amazing. Yeah, I mean, you also you highlight how Liverpool kids, because again, back to being an international port, we in that spot were uniquely advantaged in the music that we were exposed to coming in and out of the port from West Africa and the West Indies and reggae and even Chinese music. Liverpool has the oldest Chinatown outside China.
And Ellen Williams' wife.
Right.
Chinese.
That's right. And so, Bob Wooler obviously going down to get records, 45s and stuff from the American Merchant Navy guys, bringing that back and lending them to John and Paul. So, do you think that's why so many bands from the Northwest kind of exploded when, let's say Newcastle, Edinburgh, Birmingham, they weren't quite so curious and prolific? Is there something in your research that makes you think that the exposure to international music really made a difference?
Definitely the diversity of what they were getting exposed to. And one thing we haven't mentioned to this point is country and Western music.
Yeah.
That was something that I didn't know till doing the research for this, or if I'd seen it before, I didn't pay attention to it. And that was Liverpool being known as the Nashville of the North.
That's right.
Such was the country. And you know that better than I would.
Country music was always Ringo's favorite when he was younger.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And of course,
but it was on the business card of the Quarrymen, skiffle, rock and roll, country and Western.
Yeah.
And it got noted the first time they were before a producer for the BBC in early '62, right after the Decca audition that I forget the guy's name now, that was doing his assessment of the Beatles, which included Pete at the time for BBC Airplay. They did an audition, some kind of tryout. More country and Western influence than rock and roll, which is an interesting observation about the Beatles that we know. But then it manifests itself as the incredible sort of collation that the Love Me Do record was, of that blues harp and the sort of country stylings, whatever else it is. It's not particularly rock and roll.
No,
but it was an earworm.
Well, and it was also easier and cheaper to make a tea chest bass, literally out of a tea chest, and a broom handle and some string, or catgut, whatever you had. Not everybody had the money for an electric bass and cables and an amp, and they weren't that easy to come by. So if you were going to play skiffle, or it's not country, it's country and Western.
Right.
Because there's a difference.
Country and Western,
right. And because we lived in Nashville for 3 years, and boy, I made that mistake only once. Yeah. But yeah, I think for a lot of kids who wanted to emulate or, play the Village Fete and get in a band and meet girls, it was a lot easier to play that style of music because you could practically make your own, beatbox or in your own teacher's bass.
Thimbles and a washboard.
Right.
Yeah.
Spoons, they used to play the spoons.
And on the subject of northern advantages, there was also Radio Luxembourg, whose signal was stronger in the north than it was in the south of England, bouncing off the ionosphere. And come 1956, when they started broadcasting Alan Freed as part of the Jamboree program on Saturday nights for the teens, that was amazing. They weren't getting served by the BBC. And the Beatles spoke of that. It was night, and sometimes the signal would be lousy, but we were able to hear this amazing stuff. So that was another pipeline they got to what was coming out in America. Obviously, if you lived in America, you'd be getting it a lot quicker, but at least they were getting it.
Right. Luxembourg 208 was the AM signal, because I listened to it in the 70s as well. I used to take my transistor radio, and she'd say, "Lights out, time for bed. You got to go to school in the morning." And I'd have the tranny, under the pillow and the aerial sticking out, and that would be my Luxembourg 208. When you think about the pirate radio ships, wasn't that a brilliant? It was illegal because you didn't have to pay copyright, but wasn't it a brilliant idea?
Yeah.
The whole romanticism and absolutely, the artists that benefited from it were certainly there to bolster it and support it. But it's you create this void, it's going to get filled. If there's a demand, it will be filled. So it served a great purpose during the time where it was promoting all this great stuff that you absolutely were not going to get from the BBC.
Yeah, and because your BBC was still your father's radio station, and it was all suit and tie.
Auntie Beeb,
Auntie Beeb, exactly.
Correct and proper.
But so we've talked about everything from Lonnie Donegan and Rock Around the Clock and what have you. But the Beatles they were fans first, weren't they? Before they were musicians, I think they still are.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
Yeah. And
yeah.
there's been there's a blog out there that somebody went through the trouble of compiling that is nothing but photographs of the Beatles with records running the entire history of them well past the point of, when they're post Pepper. They're still big fans. There's pictures taken during the White Album sessions of them on the studio floor with piles of records. And you listen to, because the Get Back period is so well documented, it's not just whatever's in the charts at the time. They're hearing everything, not just the rock and roll stuff they grew up on. Paul is singing Build Me Up Buttercup, and you hear them on the tapes talking about what's going on. Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. They were super canny and cognizant of who their peers were and what ideas they might be able to borrow. The number one record in January 69 in England is Albatross by Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
Where does that end up being spun and repurposed? But as Sun King on Abbey Road later that year. So
there you go.
They're listening to this stuff. And there was a great quote I found from John Lennon where he's being asked in Toronto late in the year about, so what's going on with the Beatles? Why are they coming to an end? And he said something like, we were always inspired to make better versions of the records we loved. And as soon as we stopped doing that, as soon as we couldn't take a record we loved further, that's when we kind of fell apart. And that's, the proof is in the documentation of how much they loved records from day one, before they had a record contract or anything, how incredibly conversant they were, whether it was the Cunard Yanks, whether it was the listening booths at the local record stores, whether it was something they were hearing on Radio Luxembourg. They knew the product. They knew the stuff, and they were connoisseurs. They could give you the B-sides of any hit record of the day and tell you who wrote it.
Yeah, in fact, when Paul started Wings and released a bunch of singles, the B-sides were just important to Paul as the A-sides. The A-sides were what the radio would spin. But he always looked at it in the conversations that I overheard growing up as you have two chances to make a first impression. They're double A-sides to him. Mm-hmm. He hated the fact that they were called B-sides because that's a lesser song. It's not as good. Well, why are you putting it out then? It just never made any sense to him. So
it's like treasure hidden in plain sight too. For the people that were only into the hits, you may want to flip that record over, folks, because there'll be something that good on the other side. Plenty of DJs did that in America, at least well into the 70s, where the intended A-side got subsumed by the superior B-side. And to your point, his first solo single post Beatles, Another Day, has got this amazing non-album track, Oh Woman, Oh Why, which sounds, everybody's timeless. It could have been released in 1995.
Right.
Hi, Simone, a song that became a fan favorite that he played live from time to time, certainly at his sound check. So he absolutely took that stuff seriously. The album tracks along the way, or Give Ireland Back to the Irish, anticipating a BBC band, records an instrumental version minus the words.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Yeah. That a can of worms.
Yeah, I remember our phone ringing a lot when that got released. Our friend Charlie Walsh from down in Florida, who took care of Louise Harrison in her very last days. He's family to us. He's asking, Robert, what is the biggest surprise you've ever realized in your work relating to our Beatles? What was the biggest jaw dropper for you that you found out or researched? Or
well, it's funny because you come up with more questions than answers. Certainly the story of a Percy Phillips version of One After 909, that was surprising. It's like, why don't we know about that? But then you come up with a lot more questions. The fact that they spent money that they were hard pressed to raise to make that first Percy Phillips record, that'll be the day, In Spite of All the Danger. In Spite of All the Danger, co-credited to Paul and George, because George wrote the solo. Happy birthday, George. So we mentioned that in passing. When you look at the Get Back footage, all this new stuff, there's a particular moment where they're just trotting down memory lane, recalling all the earliest songs that they did. Because I Love You So, just going down all these songs that didn't rate with them. So much so that they never, ever put them on the tape, never brought them into the studio. It makes you wonder why, in spite of all the danger, until it was issued on anthology in the 90s and suddenly was out there in the currency, then Paul starts playing it live. But up until then, the Beatles never touched it. They never brought it to EMI. There's no record of it being in any sets that we have set lists of. And so it made me wonder. And then I saw the timing that they recorded it on July. I'm now doing this from memory. I have to look at my own book, but it was like 12th or something of July. It was an unusually cold day. It was a Saturday in Britain. And John Lennon's mother, Julia, is killed like a few days later.
Oh, boy.
And it made me wonder, did they become inextricably linked in their own heads to where suddenly it's got this bad association? That was a brand new song. We were all excited to play that record for her, and they never touch it after that. So it made me wonder. So it's like that's all kinds of questions pop up. Another one is Jeff Emmerich, their longtime engineer, put out a book that I would not bet my kids' lives on in terms of reliability. But nonetheless, after he dies, the word is that he's got a piece of audio tape from their first session to EMI that he was told to get rid of this, and he took it home as a souvenir.
Oh.
So this is, the story only surfaced after he died, so you couldn't really ask him about it. He certainly didn't bring it up during anthology. So it made us wonder, well, what is on this tape? And the word from people who've heard it says it seems to be from the June 6th audition, 62, with Pete Best. And that raises even more questions. First of all, you say in your own book that you started work at EMI the day before the Ringo session for Love Me Do. So we're talking September of 62. How is it you've got a tape from June of 62 of them with Pete Best before you ever worked there? How does that happen? Number one.
And who saved it? And how did you find it? And
and number two, studio protocol is if it's unreleasable tape, they don't tell you to throw it in the garbage bin. They tape over it.
They wipe it. Yeah, they reuse it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it raises more questions than it answers. And that's the kind of stuff that along the way, the stuff has been talked about, but I think in our effort to cover every base, we were diving deep on this stuff. And it's like, well, what do we know and what don't we know? So we're not the kind of authors that will put out their stuff. Yeah, we could say with absolute certainty that this was happened. That's based on our own best guess or conjecture. We try to nail the stuff down on something that can absolutely be relied upon, even if it's counter to Paul or somebody else telling their version of things that, well, it's belied by the documentation. Sorry. Like the story Paul tells about, and this is not to beat up Paul, not to beat up your Paul, but we didn't want to go to America until we had a #1 record. And when we went to America to do Sullivan Show, I Want to Hold Your Hand was #1. That's great, Paul. You got booked back in November before you had a hit record of any kind. You didn't get booked because you had a #1 record. You got booked because you were novel. You drew a crowd at Heathrow, and Ed was curious enough, and Brian was forceful enough. That's how that booking happened. And by the way, you're coming over anyway because you got booked to play Carnegie Hall on February 12th. So that's how that happened. So we tried to drill down to, if there's no documentation, we might offer a guess of the possibilities, but we absolutely are trying to rely on the best things. But if we don't know, we'll tell you.
Right. And I think, Elizabeth is saying example Blackbird, which we don't really have time to get into here. But, a lot of fans know the origin story. They've heard the tape like you have of the original demo dedicated to her mom. But again, you have to, not to beat up the boys, but at a certain point, they had all these different record labels and all these different agreements and deals and what have you. And the PR people at the record label thought story A sounded better than story B. So that became the official line. And they were told to trumpet it. And here are the talking points for this press conference. And they may think it was bullshit, but they were like, oh, well, that's, that's what's on the teleprompter. That's what we've been told to read. So who knows? Tomorrow never knows. And yesterday certainly
Case
doesn't.
in point, the Lennon Remembers interview, which he gave as the Beatles were splitting. And a lot of it was hyperbole because he was venting, basically. He was very bitter. The lawsuit was going on. It was, a bad time. Oh, and by the way, he's promoting his first solo album, Plastic Ono Band. So he's swinging wildly in all directions, contradicting himself from one page to the other. But it should have been viewed as not a statement of fact, but like, this is the conversation I'm having now to a guy who, by the way, Jan Wenner was not a journalist. He was a fanboy, was what he was. So that they got published as a book over John's objections because he knew full well, I'm not going to stand by this stuff tomorrow. He knew that. And Jan put it out anyway. in too many Beatle biographies thereafter, especially in the period after John died, starting with Philip Norman and Ray Coleman, all these other people, they took what he said in that interview as gospel. They never even parsed it or questioned it. And so suddenly that became the facts. And John knew it. And people coming after that as historians recognized what a disservice it was, not only to the Beatles' narrative and seeking out the facts, but, John knew it. Why couldn't you respect him enough to recognize he knew he was venting? He wasn't going on record with his hand on the Bible. He was just spewing.
Right. I mean, in Liverpool parlance, we'd say, it's not a deposition. I'm just taking the piss.
Exactly. He knew it.
Yeah. No, it's certainly the art of the wind-up was something that John Winston was
Oh boy,
very, very good at. And you could see him. We once upon a time, my dad, we were all like, what should we get everyone for Christmas? We were going down to Cavendish Avenue for Christmas, and the lunch was going to be at the Ashes on Wimpole Street. And somebody, I can't remember who, it might have been my Uncle Ralph, said, well, what, we've got Paul and Jane this, and we got, and you're like, what do you get John Lennon? Somebody in the room, I think it was Uncle Ralph, said, get him a wooden spoon so he can stir the shit a bit thick.
Wow, he knew him.
Oh yeah. No, John was like my Uncle Peter too. He'd throw something in the room and then just sit back and go silent and watch the bomb go off. It's just his wicked sense of humor, Yeah. Those are the reasons we loved him, and those are the reasons a lot of people didn't understand him, but those are the reasons I miss him, because
he said it. Half of what I say is meaningless.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. There is no agenda, right?
Quite often we say, what would John do?
What would John say? What would John do? Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's just crazy. So the book, this current book is ribbonsofrust.net. We can also find more about our lovely Robert Rodriguez on the old Facebookie. What did we not talk about today that, sort of skipped by in this? Oh my goodness. Fabulous.
It meant a lot for me to come on your guys' show because I reckon that I'm an American, a distance away from rock and roll in the 50s and British wartime and all that stuff. And I figured, I have complete trust in Jerry's ability to cover the studio stuff. So I'm kind of on my own covering the history part.
Yeah.
And my point, my goal was, if people that were there are satisfied that I did a decent justice of covering that era, then I'm satisfied. That if Brits think I got it right, at least most of it right, then I'm satisfied. I didn't want to hear, well, why didn't he talk about this? Or, well, that's completely wrong. It's like I go through this thing trying to do the best I can, the most reliable sources I can, try to cover all the bases I can think of. Yeah. And, this book got delayed because literally up until the last minute, I kept thinking of stuff, I need to mention this. So I kept throwing more things into it, driving Jerry absolutely crazy because it disrupt the layout in progress. So, but and I think that's part of the thinking when you are creative. And I'm not saying this as a pat on the back to myself. I'm saying this as it's just the way, it's the brain I was born with. That's what I have to work with. You're never ever satisfied, and you never ever feel finished. So no. I will look at it. I don't listen to my own podcasts. I've had to for the 300th, but as a rule, I don't. Once they're out the door, I just cross my fingers and hope I did it right. And that somebody doesn't come up to me and go, you're an idiot, which happens anyway. But I try to do the best with what I've got within the window I have, and know in advance it's not going to be perfect.
Well, quoting a line from the movie Help, which was actually captured on film 60 years ago yesterday, and I know because I was on the bicycle, a man's got to do what a man's got to do.
I've been doing it, for better or worse.
God, was that what?
60 years ago yesterday. Yep. In the Bahamas.
It's amazing. We keep hitting these milestones.
Yeah.
And I know for you it must feel like yesterday because it's so in your head, these things that stay forever. But there are people that beat up the Beatles like, why can't you answer who played bass on this track or something like that? They were busy living life at an accelerated pace that you will never, ever imagine. And they weren't chronicling things as they went along. They were trying to get through the day onto the next deadline, the next box they had to tick off. And somebody, who among us answered the question, if I were to put to you, so what were you doing September 28th, 2015? What went on that day? You're going to tell me that you're going to remember conversations you had and stuff like that? Of course not.
I think there's only Marilu Henner who could answer that.
Exactly right. Exactly right. That I remember. Yes. So, boy, if I had that gift.
Oh, I think
don't
it
know
would be
if
a
it's
curse.
a curse. Absolutely.
Would you honestly want to know what you had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day of your life?
I wouldn't want to hold on to that mundane stuff, but if like I was doing a history of something of whatever was going on, that would be a useful thing to have. But I'm not a history maker. If each of the Beatles had that memory, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. You've made some history with all of your research and all of your writings and all of your love for, as Charlie calls them, our Beatles, because they are. They're, and we really appreciate you. I know how busy you are spending the time with us today. And
I just feel like I've been incredibly lucky that what was pure geekery as a kid when I started getting into this, it made you a social pariah for the most part, but there was a place to put it, and I've been incredibly lucky. Folks like yourselves, the people I've had on the show, we've talked about Mike McGear being on the show, and Patty Boyd and Ray Connolly numerous times, people near and dear to you, as well as other leading academics and people that are willing to talk to me and talk at length, and you establish a sort of quasi community with these people.
Absolutely.
And you try to bring it forward. So I've been very, very lucky that I've been in a position that people are willing to do this, willing to talk to me and get stories out of them. Some of them are gone now in the time since I've been doing this. But it to me is a big testament to the power and the magic of the Beatles that, you get asked why the Beatles a lot, and you can enumerate and quantify things. That isn't nearly defining it properly. It's magic. You cannot. It's like the quote about dancing about architecture. Explain it to be as there are no words. There is no medium that will do it, but you feel it. You absolutely feel it. People born decades after they broke up, you will the magic when you see it, and it's like a secular religion. It's instant community. People that in life, if I was standing next to them at the supermarket, oh, you're wearing a Beatles shirt. Boom, like an instant friend. Because you get it. That what else in the world has that kind of power?
Well, and this is what's so great about the fest, and God bless Mark and Carol, because that's a lot of work. And Mark, we're all getting up there in age, but they love what they do, and they have really come a long way in their 55 years to helping create this worldwide family and the community. And then COVID hit, and then Tilly figured out Zoom, and they were able to get people on from Japan and broaden, share the love. And it really is. And in the end, right, because they've stopped being four people who are on the road making music, but the ripple effects from, clothing, fashion, Indian food, karma, yoga, lifestyle, just love in general and tolerance in general. It's the gift and humor. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
It's something that I think was evident even in Liverpool, but it was projectable. It was a quality that certainly the 73 million people watching him on the Sullivan Show picked up on in America, and that is the power of friendship. It was clear these guys were pals. What you can do when you're with a group of your friends, you can have so much fun. And that's what made it suddenly attractive, that all of a sudden these people were all these bands were springing up. Fast forward to 2021, Peter Jackson puts out Get Back. We were told this was a dismal, horrible, miserable time. You see the evidence over and over and over again, how much these guys loved each other. And were such, the friendship was so deep. And I think you can't watch that stuff and not want to be a better person.
Yeah. Well, they were in the foxhole. There are things that the two of them now know that nobody else on the planet will ever know. Not just catchphrases, but near misses, getting out of the Philippines alive in one piece. All of those things. It's almost, not to denigrate, because we have a lot of Army and Navy and veteran friends who I can't believe, and firefighters just recently, I can't believe those people's heroism for wanting to put their lives on the line. And I'm not saying rock and roll is anything like that, but when you've been through a situation in close quarters with your mates, it's almost like being on a film crew or in an army unit, or in the chef community in a kitchen. When everybody yells yes chef, you're part of one organism, and those are big units. These were 4 people.
That pressure cooker, absolutely. You get through that, you run that gauntlet, it will stay with you forever, and these are the only guys that know what I lived through. Absolutely. Okay. And there's quotes from the 4 Beatles talking about how sorry they felt for Elvis because he was one guy, but they had each other.
Yeah, they had each other's 6, as they say. Well, our regular guests will know that our very special guests always, the Limerick lady is here, and our very special guests always get a hand-penned limerick.
Don't go anywhere, Robert.
If you are sitting comfortably, it is limerick time for Mr. Robert. Are you ready? And we're projecting. We're breathing in.
I have to sit up straight and project. Okay.
And a 1, 2, 3. Rodriguez.
Oh, there you go. See, after 3, and I'm good.
The director's yelling
focus. I nearly said another word.
I'll phone you.
Word.
Yeah, don't call us.
No.
1, 2, 3. Rodriguez guides us through the past of Beatles lore, which is so vast. With Pathé reels to see, the QR codes set free. Thank you, Robert, for insights that last.
Wow. Thank you. Wow. That is amazing.
Cheap.
I don't know. It's amazing, but it's what we came up with at happy hour at the bar last night in the kitchen. So.
Oh, not that it shows or anything.
Yeah, not that it shows. There we go.
That was great. Thank you so much.
So yes, please go to ribbonsofrust.net and go find Robert's other books on Amazon. You'll see this will go on the front page of the McCartney Times at mccartney.com by the end of the day, and also on our YouTube channel. Please go buy all of his books. He's a truly amazing and lovely human. And thank you for joining us all today. And we will see you all of a sudden.
Bye-bye.
This was fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to TeaFlix, and check out Dr. Angie's books, Organic Teas and CBD, at mrsmccartneysteas.com. Toodle pip!